taken as much advantage as we could of some of Keynes's thoughts. We've been too obsessed with Schumpeter. And of course, there is some great work actually in Easy Growth by Andrea and Giovanni and others who are really trying to bring together Schumpeter, Keynes, and Minsky as well through modeling. And I actually want to focus more on the issues on, I think, what Keynes actually meant in terms of thinking big, and I'll talk about this in terms of mission-oriented investments, but also that in the end, what really needs to guide policy around innovation is what do we actually know guides business investment. In fact, Keynes's great insights were actually on what guides investment, and then as a conclusion, what government has to do. But he didn't start off with the government issue. And you know, this word secular stagnation, which was used both in the beginning from different people, but also in general, we keep hearing about it in terms of, you know, falling levels of investment captured in different ways. This is one of the graphs that we often see about gross non-residential fixed capital investment having fallen over the last decades across the world, as well as Robert Gordon's provocation about the fact that current innovations are nothing compared to the indoor toilet. You know, if you have to choose between the internet and being able to poo inside your house versus going outside, which one has transformed your life more? This has, if you want, engendered all sorts of debates about, you know, why is it, if you want, that we are no longer witnessing grand transformational changes? Why is it that the private sector is not investing? And unfortunately, those that are talking about that, sometimes if you think about the kind of arguments that are being made, it kind of feels like there's this exogenous force, you know, whether it's savings, demographics, and you look at the arguments, they're not actually capturing one of the biggest sicknesses that I think we have today, which was sort of alluded to in some of what we just heard, which is that actually secular stagnation is an endogenous effect of falling investments. And why are they falling? Well, in the public sector, not just austerity, which is quite recent, but really from the 1970s, in some ways a retrenching of the state in different ways. And definitely with the austerity policies, what's been interesting is that at best, the counter-austerity arguments made by people like Stiglitz, who of course we all respect very much, tends to sometimes just fall back into, oh, interest rates are really low, let's spend on infrastructure, which, you know, sort of gets to the digging ditches and filling them up again kind of vision. And of course an overly financialized private sector, which is really hoarding at record levels, so not investing, you know, inert capital, as well as ultra-financialized. And the work of Bill Lazonic, who's part of our Easy Growth community, has been fundamental for showing that. So I want to kind of focus on these two problems, and really focusing on the public sector part, and argue that to really have a kick-ass kind of public investment, which crowds in private investment and even does more than that, sort of dynamizes it in, we have to really understand the implications of mission-oriented investments and why they are actually quite different from, say, the kind of framework conditions and even the austerity, the infrastructure kind of ways in which we talk about you know, the need for government to be investing at this time when interest rates are so low. So, you know, just making use of the Horizon 2020, EC 2020 motto, which is we need smart, inclusive, sustainable growth. I want to kind of go through these, and for each one of them, think about what Keynes's message was. And in general, as I said, what I'll be trying to do is provide a very strong critique to a thinking which I think keeps creeping into even the innovation community, where what we're at best doing is, if you want, fixing different types of system failures, or market failures, which of course we have successfully critiqued, but even the kind of systems failures point of view is quite limited in terms of understanding what needs to be done today, in Giovanni's word, what to do. And this is because this kind of thinking of just this bandage approach, even when we look at the different things that have to happen across the innovation chain, whether it's funding of SMEs, whether it's basic science, keeps getting seen in terms of this kind of bandage approach. And when I say, you know, starting off with Keynes, I mean, his point really was so much beyond just the need for counter-cyclical spending. Yes, today we are continuing at different levels of crisis because we have pro-cyclical governments, which is not very smart. But, you know, is that enough? What happens in the boom? When recovery does start to happen, what does government actually need to do? And if you look back at Keynes's writings, this is sort of my first point of how he was misunderstood. it's not obvious that those arguing today the Keynesian agenda actually have a theory of the state across the business cycle, beyond the need for, if you want, counter-cyclical spending. And this is why I think actually Nixon, Keynes, and someone like Polanyi, who had this very clear view of policies shaping and creating markets, not just fixing them, independent, if you want, of the business cycle, is something that we should take on and really have a market-shaping, market-creating view, not just a market-fixing and, at best, systems-fixing point of view. And so, those of you who've heard me talk before, I promise not to bore you too much with the usual first point, but it's a very important point, which is that if we want smart, innovation-led growth across different types of technology platforms around all the different missions and challenges we see in the European Commission documents on innovation, we really have to understand where did the big innovations come from in the past. And this, of course, is, and hence also if we want green growth, what actually got us, aviation, IT, internet, nuclear power, nanotechnology, and it was very much a willingness and ability and organizational capacity of different public and private institutions to really operate across these different four quadrants in realistically that top right-hand quadrant, which tends to be where you have high capital intensity and high technological and market risk, really required a very active public sector across the whole innovation chain, not just the classic public good area, where you might have different types of market failures because of things like the private sector not investing enough in blue sky research, but absolutely a commitment throughout that whole chain, and also, of course, nurturing, and this is where the systems of innovation literature is so important, the feedback between all these processes. We all know we don't have a linear curve, but what's often missed is if you actually look at those organizations which were fundamental across that chain, and I've just put some here for the US, which, it's not because the US is more important, but because we keep using places like Silicon Valley to come back to Europe to drive some of our innovation policy without having understood Silicon Valley, that many of these public organizations here, just exemplified with some of these orange acronyms, were in fact mission-oriented. They very clearly did not see their role at any level as just fixing a different type of market failure, and I'll show you in a minute some nice quotes from their own websites. But these, again, include ARPA-E in the Energy Department, which today is trying to emulate its sister organization in the Defense Department, DARPA, which, of course, everyone knows was so fundamental for the internet, but also the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which has been fundamental in providing high-risk finance downstream to companies, in fact, much more in terms of the really early-stage high-risk phase than private venture capital. And again, National Institutes of Health, which have been fundamental for something like 75% of the most revolutionary new drugs, new molecular entities with priority rating. But the point is, again, if you look across that chain and then look at their websites, these are very courageous, institutions which see themselves as absolutely directly, not indirectly, not through tax credits, directly forming actively a new landscape, which, as I'll show you in a minute, has actually absolutely, evidence shows, crowded in different types of private sector activities. So the 40 years of National Institutes of Health mission towards actually forming the, if you want, life sciences landscape was later followed, about, again, 40 years later, by the venture capital community and the biotech startups. I won't go over these graphs, but this is just interesting because it shows the difference between private and public, if you want, venture capital, even though SBIR is not exactly venture capital, but this exit-driven short-termist VC model, we know from the work of people like Gary Pisano, and again, Bill Izanik and his co-author, Oner Tulum, has been quite problematic because this exit-driven kind of nature of finance, which is seeking a return or an exit in 3 years, or an IPO or buyout, is not exactly the kind of patient long-term finance that innovation requires. Anyway, the iPhone, I won't bother you with this, it's my usual little theatrical thing, but everything that makes the smartphone smart and not stupid, idiotic, and dumb, which was of course financed by these public institutions across that whole innovation chain. Apple itself, the company, got money very early stage from the SBIC program, which is similar to the SBIR program. And again, the lesson was then learned in health, energy, etc. So it's not just the military-industrial complex. But the really important point, and this is, I'm coming back now to Keynes, is that this issue about, how do we actually stimulate investment by the business community, because in the end that's the point, right? The state cannot do everything. We want public-private partnerships. We need to get business investment to increase. What's interesting, if you look across the OECD, is just how much reliance there continues to be. In fact, the updated version of this graph from the OECD shows this even more starkly, on these indirect mechanisms through, say, government support to businesses for their R&D spending, through R&D tax credits or patent box kind of policies, which really assume that business already wants to invest. When actually some really interesting studies by people like Pierre Monin show that in terms of the additionality, so making R&D happen that would not have happened anyway, many of these tax credits actually are not so successful. By the way, one particular type of tax credit in Holland, which is targeting today the labor hired by the company to do the research rather than the income generated, does actually tend to produce more additionality. But the key point here is if you look at the green lines, this is direct spend, the blue line is the indirect. This is a bit simplistic, and obviously, the studies, again, one would have to look at it much more closely, but if one had to simplistically tell you what the punchline is, it's that those countries that actually then have achieved high business spend, so these ones in the upper right-hand quadrant, in fact, what they have had is a very important mix between a direct spend through these types of spending that I just mentioned happened in the US, but this would also be in Finland and Israel, and Brazil up until a year ago, at least for the Latin American context. They have been countries which have benefited from a direct spend, which actually gets the business community to even see an opportunity to want to invest. And then what the tax credit does, or any of these indirect mechanisms, is it affects the marginal decision on top of that. Now, what's interesting about that is, if we again go to Keynes and this quote, which I absolutely love, because I think that unfortunately the behavioral finance community has hijacked the word animal spirits. This is kind of what he was getting at in this quote. I know I'm sort of misinterpreting and using this quote for my own objectives here, but what he's basically saying is, oh yeah, I use this word animal spirits, and that makes you think of tigers and wolves and lions who want to roar, but actually what you have in the business community are a bunch of hamsters and gerbils and little pussycats, which he calls domesticated animals. And the policy then imperative in the innovation community should be, okay, do we actually have a lion in the cage that wants to roar, and we just have to take away different types of impediments, whether it's forming great different types of tax incentives or whatever, or do we have a pussycat in that cage and we need to turn it into a lion and hence get these animal spirits to even be there rather than assume them and take away the impediments. And I think as a community, we have not spent enough time showing this empirically. By the way, some of the industry dynamics literature does show this, and I think we should go back to it, Giovanni. So actually a great work that you did with Dan Lovallo, who later went very far away, was showing that what actually drives entry behavior, if you just look at entry and exit dynamics, which is what one of the foci, if you want, of industry dynamics, there's very little correlation between entry and current levels of profit. There's a much stronger correlation, and you find this also with interviews if you want, talking to managers and those actually making decisions of where to go, higher correlation between entry and expectations about future growth of a sector. And what some of this work, again, on mission-oriented finance, I think has done, but we haven't profited from it enough, is showing that, in fact, these opportunities, which the business community sees, which gets them even to think about biotech, nanotech, or today green tech, have been very much, if you want, forced into existence through these direct kind of policies. And yes, we can then, get as many tax credits as we want, but without that direct opportunity creation, you don't get business investment. And our communist friend Bill Gates is very clear on this. He says government must lead, we will follow. Peter Thiel doesn't say that. And after I visited Bill Gates, sorry, this is a bit name dropping, but he did invite me to go spend 5 hours with him in Seattle. And then I'm not saying this is my fault, but 2 months after my visit, he came out with an interview where he said, yeah, the government might be sometimes inept, but the private sector is always inept. So, so government must actually lead green tech, because we're not getting that kind of investment from the green community, which is what I want to talk about now. So in some work that Gregor Semeniuk and I are doing now in ISIGrowth, I'll show you some recent results that we've seen in terms of this public versus private. And it's not versus that, it's always public-private partnerships require understanding what actually drives private sector investment. But first, let me just give you some background, if you, just kind of come back to that risk landscape I showed you before and then apply it to clean tech, what we actually find is that upper right-hand quadrant of very high capital intensity, high technological and market risk continues to be quite lacking in terms of the business community. This was some initial data that we were looking at both through the Bloomberg New Energy Finance and some other databases, which shows that at least in green, unlike in IT, there's also an emerging new, if you want, set of public actors, for example, public banks. And it's very interesting. Caetano Ben and I wrote a paper looking at the changing role of public banks, where they used to be mainly just for catching up, or what Minsky would call the capital development of the economy. But we've seen an increasing role of these actors. Think of the China Development Bank, the KfW, the Brazilian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, around the kind of VC kind of role, venture capital, and this mission-oriented kind of role in terms of kind of forcing in something like the energy event policy in Germany. And in fact, just 4 of these banks, the ones I just named, Brazil, China, European, and Germany, make up a huge percentage of the investments, especially in deployment and diffusion of these technologies. The KfW especially is fascinating because it's not only playing this counter-cyclical Keynesian role of increasing lending after the crisis versus what the private banks did, but very much directing that finance, as you see here, towards a particular area, which really was part of the whole energy event revolution. I really think it is a revolution in Germany because it's not just about renewable energy, it's about greening the entire economy. And in fact, that is what these general purpose technologies have always been about changing production, distribution, and even consumption across many different sectors. But we see this again, even the EIB, before it started to get too scared about its credit rating, increasing quite a bit its green financing. BNDES in Brazil, which we've done quite a bit of studies on, also doing that. You can bet now it's not going to happen with this new coup d'etat. And yes, I said it, there was a coup d'etat in Brazil. Anyway, moving on. And the China Development Bank, the lead actor, absolutely phenomenal in terms of how much it's spending in this space. There's a great book out called The China Development Bank Changing the Rules of Finance. And if you look at the amount of money that these particular green companies are getting in China, it looks like a huge amount. But don't be fooled, in the US, it's not much different. So Elon Musk alone, his 3 little pet projects, Tesla, Solar City, and SpaceX, got $5 billion from the US government, and Tesla itself received a very large guaranteed loan from the US taxpayer, $465 million. At the same time, think of it as a whole US portfolio. Solyndra got just a bit more, $500 million. Solyndra, massive failure. Tesla, big success. Any venture capitalist will tell you this is normal. For every success, you're going to have quite a bit of losses. What's interesting about these banks, though, is they actually structure it exactly as an investment. They actually do make a rate of return on equity, unlike the kind of investments in the US that have sort of been giveaways. And we've been thinking quite a bit about whether that's naive in a world that is no longer the world when NASA was founded, which Giovanni always reminds us was a world where a Republican military general, Eisenhower, had an upper marginal taxation rate of 91%. So in that world, compared to what we're hearing today from the Republican Party, this kind of return to public investment was less of an issue. It was also a world in which patents, by the way, were mainly downstream, not upstream. This is a world where we are increasingly patenting upstream, so the tools for research are being patented. This also affects the kind of spillovers that we often assume when we think of social returns to public investment. Anyway, so in this work, I'll just quickly show you, because it's actually from the ISIGrowth project, we found that, again, that upper right-hand quadrant has absolutely lots of public spending, not just from state banks, but also from state-owned companies, from different types of government R&D laboratories. We actually broke it down across different technologies. These 4 here are just showing you 4 particularly high-risk areas within renewable energy, so offshore wind versus onshore, marine, advanced fuels. What's the C4 again on this? Concentrated solar power. And what we've been doing is to try to better understand, instead of just doing the fossil fuels versus renewable energy kind of dichotomy, we said, okay, within renewable energy, and we broke it down into 11 different technologies, but lots of different financial actors, lots of different private actors, lots of different public actors using this Bloomberg New Energy Finance database. We found really interesting patterns in terms of the portfolios. of these different financial actors, but surely we again see what we found in, again, IT, biotech, and nanotech. We're seeing it again in the high-risk parts of green tech. You have a very strong and increasing role of these public actors, and yet we don't really understand that. Within economics, we don't really have a framework for that, because this kind of immediately makes people worried about crowding out, because you're just supposed to be setting the kind of basic framework. You shouldn't be actually choosing particular companies, particular technologies, and yet this is actually what's always happened even in the past. Coming back to the iPhone, all those technologies were picked. They didn't just happen through framework conditions. So we don't really, for now at least, in this first paper that we've done for ISIGrowth, which should be on the website next week, hopefully, we really just kind of show as a landscape, who's actually investing in what, and pose the issue of directionality. Finance is not neutral. Who is actually financing in what parts of renewable energy, and how will that, and this is going to be sort of the second paper, what do we know about how that's actually affecting the future of these particular technologies. Lastly, as I mentioned in the beginning, the two, I think, crises that we have today in terms of secular stagnation beyond the usual explanations is, on the one hand, this kind of lack of courageous direct investment in a world not just of austerity, but of public choice theory, where we worry so much about government failure that we don't even allow government institutions to take risks and to kind of play the role they have in the past. But also, I would argue, we're not just missing a new deal, a new Green Deal, we're actually just missing a deal. Where's the deal in terms of public and private actors? So we shouldn't forget that some of the most important private actors in the history of innovation actually came out of deals. So AT&T didn't just wake up one day and found Bell Labs, it was forced to. The government at the time, much more confident, 1925, was like, you know what, you're a monopoly, that's government granted, it's not a right, God-given. Patents, by the way, intellectual property rights, I don't know why we even use that word, they're not rights, they're contracts, they should be negotiated. Anyway, so Bell Labs came out of an agreement, if you want, with government, which said to retain your monopoly status, which is a government-granted status, you have to reinvest into the real economy. Today we have record-level hoarding, into innovation, but not just any innovation, big innovation that's going to affect lots of different sectors. That's where Bell Labs came from. Do we today have that kind of deal, healthy deal, not backroom deal, with the energy sector? No. Bill Lazonic's work has shown how both the IT, pharma, and especially the energy industry are ultra-financialized, spending an increasing amount of profits on areas like share buybacks. This, to me, is just one of the many different, if you want, signals of the sickness that we have today. There's other measures one could look at, but what's interesting is Apple, under Steve Jobs, did no share buybacks. Under Tim Cook, this is his big idea. And just look at the papers last week and the week before showing just how much money is being both hoarded and plowed back into these financialized areas by the four big IT companies. This is increasingly being seen as a problem, but where's the deal? So, this just shows the aggregates of $3 trillion in the last decade on share buybacks. But this, I think, has to be thought about more when we talk about Piketty. Again, coming back to Piketty again, we keep doing this. He, on the one hand, talked about the need to tax wealth, and people like Galbraith have also been very important in showing how there was a bit of confusion in terms of the kind of capital versus wealth ways in which this was calculated. But anyway, the notion that you just tax it versus let's also kind of rethink where wealth comes from. And in fact, so many of the regressive taxation policies that have actually driven the inequality that he talks about, things like reducing capital gains by 50% in just 5 years in the US, have been driven by stories about wealth creation and innovation. So again, our second communist here, Warren Buffett, who's like, hello, why did you reduce my capital gains tax? I don't even look at that. I just invest where there's an opportunity. Again, Keynes's point about what actually drives animal spirits. And he very clearly, wonderfully, he should get the Nobel Prize, says the only thing that happened after capital gains fell by 50% was an increase in inequality. Investment doesn't go up because that's not what drives investment. And again, back to Gates, he runs this American Energy Industry Council. He sounds, and he is, I think, quite progressive again, compared to very regressive things we hear from Peter Thiel. I keep saying that because the guy is a madman and keeps lobbying for very regressive policies. Gates, on the other hand, is telling the government to spend more. After the whole December COPS initiative, he and Zuckerberg came out with this 20 billion plan, but at the same time, just these 7 companies that are running the American Energy Industry Council, lobbying government to spend more. They themselves are not doing it. In fact, just in a period in which they were asking government to spend $16 billion in the last decade, they've spent almost $240 billion just on not reinvesting their profits. Google, by the way, is an exception. Someone should do a big study on Google and why it's an exception. Anyway, last quote from Keynes. Keynes, I think, had this wonderful concept of the socialization of investment. In other words, to stabilize aggregate demand, you need both government to sort of come in and make up for that ultra pro-cyclical nature of private investment and ultra volatile across the business cycle nature of private investment. But also, this is something I think that hasn't been picked on enough. And I think Robert actually